I want to share a little story from behind the scenes about what happened when our little prototype blew up and all the things that blew up with it. So we scaled it quickly, and it really kind of pushed our systems and our sanity to breaking points and beyond. But let me get started with, firstly, what was this thing? So late last year, we had an idea. It was a Sunday afternoon, like the 8th of December, so it wasn't even the beginning of December. We thought, like, what if you could get a Spotify Wrapped, but for your LinkedIn, basically for your professional life? And so we envisioned two things. One is an eye-catching highlights card, a little visual that you can share that shares your highlights of the year, as well as a ready-to-go post that summarized your previous year in your tone of voice, so in your kind of authentic voice. It was actually, it has a kind of a strange data council link, actually, because it was broadly inspired by a post that DJ Patel, who's a kind of recurrent data council speaker, shared the previous year on LinkedIn, where he went through his highlights. We called it LinkedIn Rewind. We thought it would be fun to build. We thought, a few hundred people would use it, maybe kind of, 1,000. And 4 days after coming up with the idea, we sent it to the first person to try. And that was day one. And within 6 days, 10,000 people had tried it. On day 7, we launched on Product Hunt, but honestly, by that point, the sort of viral engine was working already. And by day 20, which is at the end of day 20, we turned it off. That was by far our biggest day. 330,000 people had used it. We'd done almost 7 million AI model calls. We'd used 11 different AI models. And we had I ended up recounting the number of versions that we went through. We went through 63 versions of the workflow, of that kind of agentic workflow that we built to deliver it. And it was, the interest was so strong that actually 90,000 people signed up for a wait list for a product that we hadn't built yet, and that we'd kind of barely thought about, to be honest. It was a product that kind of writes LinkedIn posts and other social posts for you in your authentic voice. Because we thought, like, okay, well, if there's so much interest in this, then maybe there'll be a bunch of people who are interested in that, and that sort of the interest in that kind of exploded along with this. And why is that? We got a lot of really great feedback from people who really loved it and loved how it kind of captured their voice and allowed them to kind of share their highlights with with their network, with their friends, and feel really good about themselves. And kind of save time and do all of that in the margins as well. So one of the quotes here, if it's too small, is this tone of voice is super spot on. Have been trying all types of AIs and agents to get no close to this. All right. So I'm going to talk about how we built it. I'm going to talk about what went wrong, what we learned, and what we would do differently, if anything, next time. But looking back, the main kind of takeaway for me is that you can just do things. I know that's sort of becoming a meme, but you can just do things, especially in the sort of age of AI. It's increasingly the case that individuals or fewer small teams of people can just come up with something and do it. All right. So first, the idea. Like I said, it came on a Sunday afternoon, and it took 20 iterations in Figma until about 1 a.m. before we ended up with a version that my co-founders in particular, and also I agreed that didn't suck. And that is the kind of where the evolution that it went through was just kind of this like generic kind of, here's some things from the year, to something that people would actually want to share. So we captured or at least the concept was to try and capture your superpower. It was a top quote, stats that kind of made you look good. So it actually was something that people would want to share, or at least that we thought that people would want to share. So How do you do it? Well, easy, right? I mean, you just take the model, best model you can get, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, and generate this stuff, generate the superpower, give all the profile info, give all the posts from someone's LinkedIn profile, and just get the model to generate it. Unfortunately, that didn't work very well. So especially when it came to generating the post along with the highlights card, it's very difficult to get, still, even with the state-of-the-art models today, even with something like O3, which is incredible and can do so much more, these reasoning models can do so much more. At this time in December, there was really O1, that was like the state-of-the-art reasoning model. And it was, it was very slow, very expensive, but even with that, even with this O3 and the best models today, it's very difficult to get it to nail structure, tone, all the things that you'd want from an output like this, from a product like this. So the way you do it is, obviously, you break down the tasks. So let's get the model to just generate the descriptors for the highlights card, not everything else. We'll use different calls for those things. But we found that we kept on getting kind of irrelevant descriptions based on all the things that people put into their LinkedIn profile, right? I mean, so it came up with all kinds of stuff that really wouldn't be appropriate for something that you'd want to share. So, okay, instead of kind of putting all of this profile information in its raw form, let's pre-process that almost like a kind of like a pre-processing step, like one would think of it as a kind of a RAG step, and I might come back to that point later. But let's distill your profile into the key points that you'd want to pass on. But we found that wound up with really repetitive, uncreative, like highlights to share. So we added a brainstorm step, and if you just use one model to brainstorm, it often ends up with like really similar stuff for different people. So we had two separate brainstorm steps with two different models, and feeding them kind of example descriptors that we thought were good, adding lists of words that we did not want it to say because everyone suddenly was a visionary, a pioneer, a bridge builder, a catalyst, all these words that these models really love. But basically what this looked like at the sort of abstracted step is there was one model doing the real work, and then there was a bunch of models further up the chain preparing the context for that final model. So really context is incredibly important. It's still important for like the best models that we have today. And in this case, we used models to essentially summarize information, relevant information, to come up with examples for, and like a kind of chain of thought thinking for the final step, and a bunch of brainstorming for that final step as well. And we were able to use different kinds of models for those different steps. So we used the best model for that final step. We used very fast models, cheap models for the brainstorming steps. And we used a kind of a balanced model. We didn't have to be the very best possible for that first kind of let's break down the profile into the key points. That was GPT-4o Mini. And this is what it looked like. Daniel mentioned Hunch earlier. That's a company, a product that we're building. It allows you to create these like AI workflows, agentic workflows, and this is actually some of the steps from the workflow. And zooming out, this is what it looked like for the very final version that we got to, version 63. It was 25 steps, and if you kind of look at it in the sort of abstracted sense, there was a kind of this initial step of extracting and pre-processing all the data and all the examples, all the schemas, everything else that all the other steps needed. There was the sort of top area, that segment at the top where it was writing the post, and the segments at the bottom where it was coming up with the highlights card. So that was the brainstorming and so forth that I just showed on the previous slide. And all of that was to generate three outputs. One was the post, another was the outputs card, and then a third was an email that was personalized, generated for every single person. Now, you have to be really clear about what your costs are, or what your budget is, both in terms of cost and latency. So the user experience that you want to give to people as you're making these trade-offs between how do I decompose tasks, which models do I use, is this actually best used with one big model or multiple small models? And that's, one of the challenges is like, how do you actually kind of break down this the search space where there's so many different options, right? There's you can choose any model. You can write a bunch of different prompts for these models, including whatever context and different chains of models to do stuff. It's just really, really, there's so many degrees of freedom that it becomes very difficult to kind of get all of that right. And the first constraints to kind of think through are your cost constraint and your latency constraint or speed constraint, which is determined by the user experience. And then after that, kind of more operational and kind of capabilities that you want to get out. But here are some useful kind of patterns that we found very helpful that were kind of all used in that previous flow. So the first is a distillation step. So when someone has like 300 posts and they have a ton of info in their bio, distilling that down into a timeline or into here are the key themes. This is something that like models are actually very good at, even cheap and fast models. And so that's really useful as an interim step before you go to something like drafting a post. Another thing which we kind of figured out much later and ended up being a huge cost reduction driver was this next step, this sort of structured work in progress. So once we'd observed enough outputs that people had shared, and just we obsessively read all of as many of the logs as we could to kind of evaluate how well the sort of tool was working, we were able to distill with the help of different LLMs, the successful posts down into their core components and create a schema to describe that. And then use an expensive model like Claude 3.5 Sonnet to generate a personalized schema to describe the final post, and then use a cheap model to turn that into the first draft of the post. And that worked much better than the other way around. And it worked much better than this step over here, which is what we kind of initially used, which was 3 Claude 3.5 Sonnet sort of expensive models to write drafts in parallel that we then synthesized into a better draft. So we experimented with so many different patterns, but this one was pretty good, but it was pretty expensive. Then it's sort of this is quite a common one. It's you generate a draft, you review it, you critique it, and then you can iterate it. I like to think of that as like thinking injection, because you take that initial draft, you take all the feedback on it and recommendations, and you put all of that into the context of that final step, the smartest model that you can, just to get it kind of bootstrap its thinking and get it an output faster. And then finally, hallucination check. It probably wasn't 100% accurate, but it was surprisingly accurate. We didn't find any issues once we implemented this. And the specific case for us was that the posts would include URLs to previous posts, so that this end of year wrap-up post could basically link back to your previous posts and things like that. And if as a sort of first output, those URLs would quite frequently be incorrect. But then just having one step that just checked those URLs against in the output versus a safe list of URLs actually made it work. There are other techniques one can use by actually like following those different URLs. We did actually have like a code runner that was like running some stuff. Like we use modals infrastructure for it. But yeah, that was for actually checking URLs. This was like absolutely sufficient. So on the one hand, there is no one model to rule them all, yet. There's so many different trade-offs, starting with cost and latency, and these, trade-offs becomes, more and more kind of like judgment-based, because they're extremely difficult to kind of evaluate in like a quantitative way, like how. Like a good example, I think, is the context window, which every model tells you how many tokens it can accept as context, but that doesn't really adequately express how good it is at utilizing that context in either kind of hallucination-free, needle in a haystack kind of way, or just in a way that doesn't poison its ability to kind of think more creatively or do kind of the full range of things that you'd want it to do. And the only way I think currently to really develop a sense for like different models' capabilities is to use them every day, or at least as close to every day as possible. I checked my logs again from our own tool. It's like, and just as like a reference point, I run almost 1,500 prompts per week. Those are not like automated prompts; those are kind of live kind of prompts against a bunch of different models. And I don't think that you need to do that many, because it's got to a point, at least for me, maybe I'm kind of overconfident in my ability to do so, but I do think like model taste is like a meta skill. And within just a couple of prompts, you get a really like clear sense or a clear feeling of how a model is going to perform more generally. It's quite strange if you haven't developed it yet. I encourage you to try. It's quite weird when you start like communing with different kinds of models, very quickly. So, like, given all of those characteristics and trade-offs, I think that like at least for us, our AI model go-tos currently, they've evolved slightly, over the last 4 or 5 months, but it'd be typically like Claude 3.5 Sonnet or 3.7 Sonnet. Now, honestly, there are trade-offs between 3.5 and 3.7 Sonnet. 3.5 still feels like it listens to you more. 3.7 is more capable a little bit, but but it's great. Gemini 2 Flash, 2.5 Flash is now kind of in preview, but Gemini 2 Flash is so fast. It can take in a ton of context. 4.1 Mini is very good, like just for balanced kind of basic tasks. When people say like models are becoming commoditized, which I don't really believe, models seem to be, maybe this is the spicy take for the day, I don't know, but like models are actually becoming more and more different as they as they kind of increase in capabilities, at least it seems to me. But some capabilities are kind of commoditized, and I would say that for those kind of commodity capabilities, GPT-4o Mini, GPT 4.1 Mini is really good bang for your buck to access those kind of like generic kind of core model capabilities. And then O4 Mini and O3 are really, they're pretty new and they're pretty incredible. And I think we're at the very early stages of trying to figure out like how best to use them in production environments. Okay, so learnings so far. For it to be viral, people must want to share it. There's no one model yet, but there are a bunch of good ones that have like tons of trade-offs. I think model taste is learnable. You've got to be clear up front on your constraints, which is cost and speed, and then iterate. You just got to iterate through that model selection, prompt selection, context and chain development, and then there are a bunch of useful patterns that you can go for. Okay. So that's what happened before launch. And once people start using a product is really like when the challenges begin. And we, from day one, started using, it sounds kind of crazy, but we used Slack as our logging database. Okay. And it was one of the best choices that we made throughout this process. We already have used other kind of logs. We log everything anyway. But Slack was amazing under load. It sort of never slowed down. It was only a few seconds latency max. And it allowed us to watch all of the raw data, which initially was just kind of like, these are the new requests, etc. But we added in all the outputs. And this is something that we've done now for every single one of our production AI workflows and AI agents, is we've added in all the inputs and all the outputs so we can watch them and read them as they come in. And because of the way Hunch works, we're allowed to actually click through into the canvas to see exactly what happened. If the output looks a bit strange, or if the input wasn't something that we would have considered, we can go in, edit the prompts, republish that tool, redeploy it kind of immediately. So it created an extremely fast feedback mechanism for us. So before we hit like day 2 or 3, we had already gone through like 30 variations, 30 versions of the tool. The other thing we did is we implemented Datadog. We especially did not put in too many metrics to start with. We looked at, what were the key metrics compared to the last 24 hours, last 48 hours, so we can basically see it was like very seasonal initially as we were kind of moved through different time zones. But we quickly figured out that we wouldn't have predicted like the core metric, the most important metric for us to monitor in this campaign was the number of queued rewinds, and the fact that we had to get that to 0 whenever that went up, past there, and it eventually, spiked past 10,000. Rewinds that were queued. The wait time, spiked to like 10 hours. And that was really that was our kind of very quick check on the health of the system. As soon as we woke up in the morning, is this going okay? But we wouldn't have predicted that initially. We started very lightweight and added that very soon. And at the same time, when you have users and you're starting to get some traction, that creates its own set of problems. And we were deluged by feedback from people saying, I've been waiting for 5 minutes for this, I've been waiting for 20 minutes, I've been waiting for 6 days, these sorts of things. And with a small team, we had 6 people. 2 of them were on vacation because this is the last 2 weeks of December. They didn't all stay on vacation, unfortunately, the whole time. But it was a challenge to kind of manage everything while all of this feedback was coming in. And then the first real challenge started, which is that our traffic was spiking, our API usage was spiking across all our providers, OpenAI, Gemini, and Anthropic, and we were essentially cut off. And I'm not throwing Anthropic under the bus. They were they're great to work with or whatever. This is just what happened to us as like a kind of, little startup, our rate limit was maxed at 400,000 tokens per minute, and we needed at least 20 times that. And I know very large enterprises that weren't getting anywhere near that from Anthropic and some of the other providers as well. And so basically, it became a full-time job to track down different execs at these companies, trying to get rate limits increased, try to get some free credits. Largely unsuccessful, unfortunately, but it was what we were able to do very quickly is switch over to OpenRouter for a bunch of our usage, and switch over. We use every single model provider out there, And we were able to switch over quite quickly. Ironically, I guess maybe it's not ironic. Maybe this is the whole point of something like SOC 2 is that like we did a tabletop exercise, literally a few days beforehand about like, well, what would happen in a kind of a disaster situation where one of your providers goes down. So we're able to switch out very quickly. But that is something I think is extremely important that I've seen people in production not plan for, and that is like just abstract those API calls so you can make them easier to switch to other providers if you need to. And then the nightmare scenario. So our database was so under provisioned. It was on a tiny instance, and it completely buckled. And the simple fix, kind of upgrading the instance, it got stuck modifying for hours, and we were totally dead in the water. We were on a support call for more than 6 hours with AWS for them trying to upgrade and restore from a backup. Eventually we were able to get that done, but it was really painful. And the sort of at 2 a.m. when this thing happens, which is of course when it happens, you're not really at your best thinking, and you start getting tired and emotional, and you're not like making the best decisions. So we didn't even think about the fact that we've got so many users coming to our front door. And that's down as well, because it was just this was just a prototype, right? This wasn't like some production system that we thought like, okay, cool, this is ready for load. This was just a little kind of toy prototype. And it didn't even occur to us to put up like a type form to capture people's details for like a couple hours. So it's like as much as possible, obviously over-provisioned stateful infrastructure. That's not where to save the pennies. But also, like, if you can think one step ahead to like, okay, well, what happens if everything goes down? Like, what should we do? Like, put up a type form would be like a really good, or something like that would have been a good thing to have thought about in advance. And then while this was all happening, we did the product hunt launch. Okay, and that was like for us, it was not something that we should have done. Like we romanticize Product Hunt. We, long-time user, kind of, love going on to Product Hunt, and we were very excited to be on there. But the reality was, like, the product had already like gone viral. We didn't need to do that. We were actually already suffering, and the opportunity cost of like staying awake all night, because if you've ever launched on Product Hunt, what happens is that the launch happens at midnight Pacific time, and the first few hours are really important. And so like the more online you are, the more you're kind of talking to your users, the more you're kind of just trying to be present and available and help shepherd it, the better. So that was already on kind of like no sleep. Going a full night and day without sleep was definitely not the best thing for us. But like we didn't even think about it. It was there was like another thing where we had like almost like pre-decided, like we're going to do this. This is going to be awesome, and like it wasn't the most important lever we could pull at that time. And I think that's just like a useful thing to keep thinking, like especially like in this sort of viral context where everything you do in those earlier days, like it lifts the curve for everything else. It's even more important to be kind of disciplined and to figure out, like, even though you're all excited and all of that, like to actually focus on the right things. All right. Okay, so learnings, we went through a bunch of them. Logs in Slack scale surprisingly well. Read the logs, monitor, very few crucial metrics. Be able to switch your AI providers, over provision your infrastructure. Focus your energy on making the difference, and as much as possible, plan for issues kind of ahead of time. All right, a few more things. As we went from 10,000 to 100,000 users, the dominoes really started to fall. Okay, the first was email, and we had never had to handle like huge scales of email before. Our background is more like B2B software. And what we found is like we basically Googled how to do this, and 5% email click-through is what we had initially. And we were sending 2 emails. One is this confirmation email that says like, okay, like thanks very much for submitting. There may be a wait time, we'll send it to you. Now that generic email, because suddenly it was appearing out of nowhere, triggered spam filters. And so our email deliverability was really low. Click-through rate was really low as a result. So we removed that generic confirmation email. Another thing we did was we moved to a provider that was able to balance like sends over time as well as IP addresses. So that kind of helped our deliverability a lot. And then the third thing we did is we added to our kind of workflow, our tool, like 100% personalized email content. So it was like, that was just as personalized as the post. And then within like 2 days, we had 50% email click-through. So it's like, it's possible to get right. And then I'm looking at the time, I don't know, like, do I have 8 minutes? 8 minutes, okay. I'll go through some of this like pretty quickly, but basically we had we had an async architecture challenge because it got to a point where the queue workers were spending all of the CPU time like polling Redis for status and not executing the tasks. So it's really important to not just like look at task latency, but inter-task latency as well. And we eventually switched like to this contributor PR for Arc to help like solve the problem. So it also fortunately was fine, but it was really difficult to figure out exactly what the problem was. And that's partially because we were using like less battle-tested infrastructure. Then the final boss for us was like an external ceiling that we couldn't break. So it was external APIs, third-party APIs to get some data that we needed, and like those rate limits eventually, like we pushed them as high as we could. We added substitutes as much as we could, but basically it was like that was the one thing that we couldn't overcome. And that is like that drove like really high waiting times at times. And when people are waiting for a long time, that really does like reduce virality. I mean, even though like this was still like growing on average 40%, the median growth rate per day was like 42% throughout the whole time, which compounds a lot. But that's this is the thing that ultimately was like the final boss that we couldn't get past. So like consider like the UX of like what happens when you have something that like actually does limit your ability to provide the service you want. So like the learnings for us are like take email much more seriously. You've got to warm up those email domains. Also likewise with your asynchronous architecture, and then think about those external APIs that you're dependent on. And then kind of finally, throughout all this time, we were iterating on cost and quality. Like these are the two things that seem kind of in opposition with when it comes to LLMs. And what we did, we got a little table here showing kind of over time, over the number of days, the number of versions that we iterated through, the proportion of requests that those versions handled, and the cost indexed to like the first versions, what the cost drop was. So initially, all the iterations were just trying to get this thing working and trying to get the quality up. And then it was like we had the issue with the different rate limits from different providers. So we were iterating there, trying to improve that. And then like finally, we ended up trying to really bring down costs. And the way that we did that is by using cheaper models, of course. I mean, that's like, it's just got to be part of it. But part of the challenge with using kind of cheaper models is that you got to use kind of more examples. And more examples also increases the context that then drives up your bill. So it was a real challenge. One of the kind of central challenges of this sort of iteration process was trying to identify which examples like actually drove quality, given the huge variation in inputs that we have. People have profiles in like different languages, and different people do very, very different things, and so like trying to get like the right suite of examples is just once again, like I don't think that there's some like quantitative way of doing that easily in most cases, in most domains. It's really a lot of iterating, trying them out, and seeing what works. But for us, it was absolutely right. You got to like prioritize quality first. Because if your product is viral, of course, like most of your costs are always kind of in the future. So like, and once we were able to get that quality up, it was really a question of like, how do we balance the costs? And one of the really useful things that we had is that we actually saw what people were posting like on LinkedIn. And so whenever there was a discrepancy between what someone posted and what was generated for them, we knew that that would have been a better output if we had generated that. So we used like the learnings from what people would edit to go back into the examples in the bowels of that of our kind of workflow. So what will we do differently? Not a whole lot, to be honest. It was kind of fun, and like I do think we would have database replicas from the start. We would have proper email infra warm up. Maybe not have half the team on vacation. But I think that you just got to launch and go for it and iterate, and it's possible. Like almost all of the issues that we encountered were solvable, and yeah. So I think in other words, just embrace the chaos. Launch, iterate, have fun, and like that's the way to do it.